Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
I want to take a moment to talk about something that may feel unrelated to today's show, but it is related, it's important, and urgent. Last week, Congress defunded public media. Connecticut Public lost 10% of its funding. That accounts for more than $2 million. It's too soon for us to know what the full impact will be, but we do know that there will be changes to what you listen to, read, and watch. Many of the shows you enjoy will be harder to make. News in rural communities will be harder to cover, and free and freely accessible programming that you enjoy will be in jeopardy. Whether you agree with Congress's decision doesn't matter right now. What does matter is that you're here and you're listening. That tells me that you find something worthwhile about this show and maybe about public radio in general. If that's true, I want to ask you to donate. Connecticut Public needs monthly donors to help replace what we've lost and protect what we stand to lose. Congress has already made up its mind, but today is your turn to make up yours. If you like listening to Connecticut Public, if you depend on NPR News for stories from across the country and the world, and if you enjoy Disrupted, the best thing you can do today is give. You can start a monthly donation at ctpublic.org/donate. And now, this week's show. Studying oysters can help us understand how Connecticut's shoreline is changing. Studying lizards can help us understand the history of life on our planet. Biologists research living organisms, and in doing so, they help us understand not just ourselves, but the ways that our lives are intertwined with those of every other species. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with Connecticut biologists. They'll share how their work helps us see what's going on in the world around us. Later in the show, we'll hear from a marine biologist who studies oysters, clams, and scallops. She'll discuss her research and the impact of federal funding cuts. But up first, Martha Munoz is assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. She's also assistant curator of vertebrate zoology at the Yale Peabody Museum. She's a recipient of a 2024 MacArthur Fellowship. Martha, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here.
We're excited to talk with you about your work that has been recognized now nationally and internationally. But before we talk about the scholarship and the work, I'm really curious about your journey. You grew up in New York City. You cultivated this love and respect for nature. And for people who aren't familiar with New York, that may seem disconnected because they think of New York City as just concrete, tall buildings, and not a lot of green space. Talk to us a little bit about growing up in the city and that connection and love of nature.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And it does seem a little unusual to fall in love with nature while growing up in New York City. And I will admit there is some truth to that. I grew up in a, tall building surrounded by concrete and steel and asphalt. But New York City does have some places where one's imagination can run wild with nature. Some of those are some of the public spaces that New York City offers. So I spent a lot of time in Corona Park, for example, which does have forested areas. And as I recall at that time, a little nature learning center as well that I visited often as a child. And there were other places, some of the great institutions in New York City, such as the American Museum of Natural History, the Queens and Bronx Botanical Gardens, and the Bronx Zoo. And even though these are not the same as taking going for a hike in the Amazon jungle, they are places where you can metaphorically travel the world, you know? In the American Museum of Natural History, I was able to travel back in time to walk with dinosaurs. I was able to go to the Hall of Biodiversity and explore life in a deep jungle. I was able to go to the Hall of Marine Life and imagine what life is like in Antarctica and at the bottom of the ocean. And through these experiences where I was able to, draw inspiration from the natural world, I was able to sustain this interest, to fuel this passion, and also, participating in the libraries in New York City, get books, for free to be able to connect with the natural world as well, which I often did.
You've just spoken to what I think needs to really be emphasized, particularly in this moment, which is the importance of museums, of libraries, of spaces and opportunities for people to be curious, to explore, to imagine life beyond where they are, but to also appreciate where they are and what surrounds them. And in that journey of exploration for you as a young person, was there a moment or experience that made you say, I am going to be a scientist? This is what I want to pursue? Or was that a path that just sort of came for you?
That's a very interesting question. I did not know I was going to be a scientist because I didn't know what it was to be a scientist. It wasn't a term that was in my lexicon. I did go to a very good high school, the Bronx High School of Science, and I was exposed to a lot of scientific thought and knowledge. But it wasn't until I actually went to college that I really learned what being an actual scientist, a modern day scientist, was like. And the way that I made this discovery was in two ways. First, I started working in labs because I was a biology major and I had work study and I wanted experience in scientific settings. And I started working in a lab. It happened to be a neurophysiology lab. And on my first week there, I was, dissecting larynxes from frogs to study the development of their vocalizations. And that was immediately a transformative experience to, go from, an organism and a question to start actually running experiments and seeing data flutter across the screen and getting for the first time the real thrill of scientific discovery. So that was a transformative moment that cemented for me that I had found what I had been looking for.
You are an evolutionary biologist. And so share with our listeners what that work looks like for you. What does it mean to be an evolutionary biologist?
That's another great question because one of the things folks will reasonably immediately think of with evolution is that it happened in the past. So how can we study organisms today to really understand how things happened in the past? And that requires a little bit of explanation. So let me take perhaps a step back and share a bit about my research and what motivates it. So evolution is a remarkable phenomenon. It's the mechanism that has produced all of the biodiversity that we see today. Now, when I started studying evolution, I was struck by one of its major features, which is that it doesn't proceed equally across the tree of life. By this, I mean that some organisms and some of their traits can evolve much more rapidly than others. So consider, for example, the Autobahn in Europe, a place where folks can drive as rapidly as they want. You will find cars zipping along at warp speed. Now, consider by contrast, New York City or I-95 at rush hour. Things move much more slowly. This is actually a lot how evolution proceeds. Everyone is still in a car and moving on a highway, but we're not moving at the same rate. So why is that? What causes evolution to go into overdrive in some cases and essentially straddle the slow lane in others? So I became curious with this phenomenon, and through the course of my work on lizards, what I've discovered is that organisms have agency in this process. They are not simply, passively at circumstances whim and mercy. They have the capacity to dictate whether and how much natural selection they experience. And through these behavioral interactions, which we can begin to unpack, we can actually explain a lot of the disparity in evolutionary rate across the tree of life. When organisms shield themselves from natural selection, they slow down evolution. And when they expose themselves to natural selection, they speed it up. So it turns out that just by studying the contemporary behaviors of organisms we see today, in my case, mostly reptiles and amphibians, we can use those behaviors and map them onto the tree of life and then examine how those relate to rates of speciation and rates of trait evolution. And we're able to actually explain a lot of the variation we see just by looking at how organisms interact with their environments today.
Tell us more about how that popular understanding of evolution or misunderstanding, if you will, how
Yeah.
that differs from the scientific approach that you and others are part of.
Well, evolution, at the simplest level, is simply a change in how the genetic composition of a population looks from one generation to the next. That is the most basic, simplest definition of evolution. Darwin, even though he's widely credited with coming up with the concept of evolution, that's actually not true. The concept of evolution is, much, much older than that. What Darwin provided, along with another contemporary of the time, Alfred Russel Wallace, was the mechanism by which evolution unfolds, which is natural selection. On the Origin of Species was not a treatise on the existence of evolution, but rather on an argument for natural selection as its primary mechanism. And now that we have a good experimental basis with which to demonstrate it, it is very much robust, well demonstrated, and cooked into our basic understanding of biology to the point that one could argue, actually, it has been directly said that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That's how integral it is to it.
As a scientist, a research scientist, you spend so much of your time in the field of observing organisms and understanding really the daily lives of the organisms you're studying. And I've heard you mention lizards a few times. I think you are helping me develop a better appreciation of lizards. And I'm curious about what that experience is for you, to be in the field, to be able to understand what those organisms can teach us instead of believing that, as humans, we have all the answers, we have all the ways of knowing. I imagine that being a scientist in some ways can be humbling because you can better appreciate that beauty and also appreciate what it is that we can learn. What is that experience for you?
I think there are three main vehicles by which I, at least, and certainly other scientists, get our ideas. So one is through scholarship. It's impossible to know what is the bleeding frontier of knowledge if you don't know what that base is. So a lot of what we do is actually spent with papers, manuscripts, with books, and making sure that we know the origin and development of ideas and what is known about organisms. And through that exercise and conversation with other scholars and colleagues, think about what might be the next frontier to push in or where ideas could be connected that haven't been connected. Then it is absolutely vital, at least for the type of work that I do, to spend time in the field. Spend time, even without the purpose of data collection, just doing pure natural history and observation to see what organisms are doing. There's a lot that can be gained simply by spending quality time with animals and quietly observing their behavior. And then the third component, which I think is also absolutely vital, is conversation with local naturalists. So I do a lot of my work in the tropics, mostly in the Caribbean. And I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are naturalists and scientists and professors there. And I converse with them about my ideas and my observations, and I ask them their observations and ideas. And through this cross-pollination, is how ideas are born. There is a tendency, I think, just with some of the misconceptions you brought up about evolution itself, to think of science as this enterprise of solitary geniuses and, pointy-headed academics in their little ivory towers. And in my experience, this is rarely the case. It is fundamentally collaborative, and The more heads you put together, usually the better ideas you come up with, because the more perspectives you provide in the room, the more likely you are to happen upon something that someone else didn't think of. So I think the best science and most science is collaborative. And I include the organisms as part of that collaboration.
That was MacArthur Fellow and Yale evolutionary biologist Martha Munoz. Coming up, Martha explains why it's important for biologists to overcome their fear of failure. And later, we'll hear from a scientist whose work looks to restore shorelines right here in Connecticut. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with Connecticut biologists to learn what their research can tell us about life on Earth. We've been talking with evolutionary biologist Martha Munoz. She won a MacArthur Fellowship in 2024. Martha studies how organisms react to changing environments. Those behaviors can help determine how an organism evolves. Given that research, ask Martha what her work can tell us about the impact of climate change.
You know, as an evolutionary biologist, we tend to think on very long time scales, million-year time scales. And one of the things that is incontrovertible about having that sort of deep time retrospective is that the only permanent is change. The environment has and will continue to change, sometimes very dramatically. But what these long-term perspectives also tell us is that the rate of change is absolutely vital to understanding how organisms have responded in the past and how they might respond in the future. And one of the challenges with ongoing global change isn't so much that the environment is changing. We know that it does, it has, and it will. It's the rate at which it's doing so that is historically unprecedented. And that rate of change, if you think about how organisms can respond, one of the major ingredients that dictates whether and how whether evolution will happen, whether organisms can adapt, is time. And time is one of the things that is quite limited at the moment. So that, I will say, one of the major concerns, at least when thinking about the global biodiversity crisis, is that the rate of change is much faster than has historically been the case, and that time is vital for allowing organisms the buffer to adapt.
And I think that time is also vital for affirming the voices, affirming the excellence and expertise of people who are committed to elevating our understanding and connection, but also charting a path forward. And you are solidly within that cadre of excellence and brilliance. In 2024, you were named a MacArthur Fellow, that we affectionately like to refer to people as MacArthur geniuses, because of the ways that you are thinking about the advancement of knowledge and connection. It is an amazing honor. But I am also just curious what it meant for you when you received that notification that you are now in this very august group of people who can be called MacArthur Fellows. What was that for you?
Wow. Humbling and overwhelming and wonderful is what it's been. I could never have predicted it. One could never predict something like this, but it is overwhelmingly wonderful, and I am full of gratitude for it. I will say that it has been one of the most affirming and motivating things that have happened in my career. When you are an academic, your feedback is often quite sporadic. You submit a manuscript and a few months later you get feedback. It's often quite critical, and you have to go back and revision. Sometimes we give talks, but for the most part, I live somewhat the life of a cloistered monk, among my scholarship, and feedback is fairly scant and far in between. To not only get feedback, but feedback of this nature has been such an affirming experience that I'm onto something that's worth pursuing, that I really am doing something that is considered generally of value. And it is one of the things about the MacArthur in particular is that there's a certain purity to the process. I will likely never know who nominated me. I would love to share my gratitude with those individuals, but I think it's by design that we don't really know who these people are. Which tells us that in order to be nominated, someone genuinely has to feel pretty strongly about the value of your work to not only go this extra mile, but to do it knowing they're likely never to get credit for that effort. Um, that you can't hear that or know that without feeling really motivated and affirmed in what you're doing.
I think it is a well-deserved recognition for you, for your work, for the clarity that your work brings. And I hope that you know how much your work inspires other people, whether it's young scholars, budding scientists, others who just see this is a person who charted this journey, who is curious and is using that curiosity to raise our overall understanding and our overall commitment. It is so timely at a time, Martha, where we are seeing lots of cuts to research funding. We're seeing lots of questioning of the value of scientific knowledge, the value of education, things that we thought, scientific knowledge shouldn't be politicized. It just
Mhm.
is. And
Mhm.
yet that is the moment that we are in. What do
Mhm.
you say about the value of the kind of work that you do, the work of others, that should continue because it can help us better understand ourselves, the organisms around us, nature around us, and move forward? What do you say in the face of those critiques and cuts?
Um, well, it's a bigger it's a bigger situation than one person could reasonably tackle, but I will affirm that we as a society, and I don't just mean our country, I mean worldwide, we rely on knowledge. And in order to get that knowledge, we need to support the people who seek it. And so I think it's more than just science. I would make the same argument for the value of the arts and poetry, for access to free knowledge. I think access to knowledge is what allows us to progress and to push forward. Yes, I think that's true for the sciences, but I think that's true for any domain of inquiry. What is more vital to understanding the human experience than poetry and literature? So I think every domain of knowledge provides value to our understanding of ourselves, of our place in the world, of the future we must attend to, and to conserving the planet on which we all rely.
I hear in that answer also a generational understanding of where we are today, but what was before us and what may come. And
Mm,
I'm thinking here of the work that you do with young people as a
mm,
museum curator,
mm,
of bringing them into this experience of, yes, this is something that you can be just as excited about, and how we tell those stories across people, across generations, and really develop that appreciation for the natural world, which for some people can be very different from being a professor. But at the
mm.
core of it is this teaching and understanding. What's your experience as you're working with young students and young scholars about cultivating that appreciation?
I I think I have a multidimensional answer. I think one of the things I've noticed is I think that first step into science is really hard and very intimidating, more so than I even gave it credit for. Folks are incredibly afraid of what one might call failure, so to speak. I put that in quote marks because I don't see it as failure, but there is an intense push to succeed and an intense fear of failure, whatever that looks like for folks. So, one of the first things I do whenever I mentor someone, and this turns out to be fairly true for the undergraduates, for the high school students, for the graduate students and the postdocs, is a fear to really be brave and intellectually bold because of a fear of failure. And this is something to which I can relate. When I was a PhD student, I remember those first few years I was at Harvard. I felt intimidated. I didn't want to, fail. I had this amazing opportunity, and I was scared to take on dissertation ideas that were a little bit risky or outside of the box. But it's only in that process that you can really push the field forward and really challenge yourself to be your best self, to bring your best to the table. So I had excellent mentorship, and I had someone to help me gain the confidence to grow and to essentially free myself from that constraint. And it didn't happen overnight, it took time. And I had support through that process. So part of what I do is to pay that support forward and to understand that where I was is where others are today, and that those folks need support as well to gain the courage to also let go of that fear and to know that the process of science is the process of doing and redoing and trying and tripping and getting up and starting again. And it doesn't change. It's not that I suddenly now don't do things that could fail. Any project that one does has the capacity to not pan out the way that we thought it would. But always in that process, we learn something. There's always something new that can be gathered. And we use that to dust ourselves off, refine our hypothesis, try a new experimental design, and go at it again. Now, because you asked specifically about the museum, I can speak a little bit to that because I feel a very personal tie to the museum, because I would argue I'm not sure I would be here without something like the American Museum of Natural History to keep me connected to this passion that I had. I think it would be excellent if the next generation of youngsters didn't have to get to college to understand that being a scientist is a career to which they can aspire. And being a scientist can take many forms. It's not just being a professor in a university, though for some that is the best way for them to be a scientist. There are a lot of agencies, biotech companies, industries, government. There are a number of ways that folks can become scientists. I would love for the next generation to know that this is an accessible career to them, and that there are people who grew up in circumstances similar to theirs who find themselves now as scientists. So part of what I do is participate in outreach events, where scientists are connected with the local public who actually bring props to a table and talk to kids and tell them, hey, I'm a scientist and here's what I do. And another is through exhibits. And so I'm working currently on an exhibit on some of our work on lizards. And as part of that exhibit, we're including a few photos of us in the field and a little Meet the Scientists information that will be part of that exhibit. And I'm not unique in this capacity. I think a lot of us are unified in this purpose of not just inspiring about nature, but getting the message out about the sorts of careers that people might consider if they're interested in science and nature. And there may be more than the ones that they know of.
You have me thinking the scientific method really is a compass for life, right? The trying, the doing,
Oh,
seeing
yes.
failure as a learning opportunity and a learning experience, but also thinking not just about the product, but the process of learning and exploration, and the need for us to curate those kinds of spaces for young people to see
Yeah.
that, to be empowered by it, and to be encouraged. And that is solidly the work that you and others are doing. But we are so glad that you have joined us on Disrupted to talk
Thank
about the
you.
work that you're doing in that regard. Martha Munoz is assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University. She's also assistant curator of vertebrate zoology at the Yale Peabody Museum. Martha is a 2024 MacArthur Fellow. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Coming up, a marine biologist talks about her research and the way that it's been affected by funding cuts. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with biologists about how their research can help us understand the living world. Our next guest is doing that work right here in Connecticut waters. Her work looks at how animals like oysters and scallops interact with our shoreline. Maria Rosa is assistant professor of biology at Connecticut College. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Before we talk about your research, which is fascinating, I want our guests to get an understanding of who you are, not just as a scholar, but as a person. Share with us what got you interested in biology.
Well, I like to call it the nerdiest way to get into science, and that was through the Reading Rainbow, which was one of my favorite shows on PBS. And they used to do the series called A Day in the Life, and LeVar Burton read a book called Day in the Life of a Marine Biologist. And I went to the library, picked up that book. I loved it so much. I still actually own the book. And it was just this great scientist. She was doing turtle research out at Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And I was like, this is the perfect job. This is what I want to do. And I was in sixth grade, seventh grade. Yeah, I was in middle school. So of course, everyone is like, you're not going to be a marine biologist. Everyone wants to be a marine biologist when they're in the seventh grade. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
I think it's a great reminder of the value of public media, that this show that was around literacy and reading also helped you think about the possibilities of career, of passion, and of interest, even at such a young age. Is the career that you have now as assistant professor of biology, is that what you envisioned as a middle school student, or have you been able to take that passion into different directions?
Well, it did. How do I put this? I'm doing something that I could never have imagined as a middle school student, right? So it set a thing because I didn't know any marine biologists. I was an immigrant. I'm an immigrant, a child of immigrants. And, it was you're going to become a doctor or a lawyer. Everyone knows how that goes. And so this idea of doing this was not, it set the seed for sure. But I didn't really know what that meant. And it was through different experiences. I was an EPA fellow, so I loved the EPA, where I got to do research with all these scientists and I got to ask questions. And I remember a conversation with a scientist I was working with out of a NOAA lab. And I asked him, how do I get your job? And he said, you need a PhD. So I was like, okay, I'll have to go get a PhD.
You mentioned being a fellow at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And
Yes.
so I see a clear through line to the type of research that you do now and that concern about the environment and how organisms change, respond, and react to the environment. Talk to us about the research that you are doing overall, but especially here in Connecticut. What is your research?
Oh my gosh. So we joke that I have the scientist equivalent of ADHD, where I just want to do all the things. Breaking it down right now would be I want to protect habitats. A lot of the things I care about, their habitat is being destroyed. So most of you may be familiar with oysters, clams, right? Scallops. They're very important organisms and they create habitat, especially oysters. They create these wonderful reefs that provide habitat for other organisms. They're called ecosystem engineers. They change the flow of water around that allow things to settle, that protect our shoreline from wave action, right? That protect it from erosion. And we're losing a lot of that as their habitats are being destroyed. So most of my applied research is around restoring some of these habitats. So I do what's called living shorelines. That's the biggest project I have right now in the Thames River in Connecticut. Some work around marsh restoration and some work around eelgrass restoration. I know I threw a bunch of stuff out there. But what all of these have in common is that they're amazing habitats for marine organisms. And they also provide what we call ecosystem services. So these are these tangible things. If you were to put price on it, for example, mussels can reduce enough nitrogen or do enough nitrogen removal that it's the equivalent of about $100 million a year if we as a system or as people had to go in and remove all that nitrogen from the water. So that's what an ecosystem service is. It's where they do something for the environment where if we had to go in and do it, it would cost us money. Things like protection from storm surge, I already mentioned that. They serve as fish habitats, essential fish habitat. So anyone that relies on commercial fisheries needs these organisms to kind of, these habitats, healthy habitats to provide that. So that's my applied research. And then I do work in the lab to see how organisms are reacting to the environment. These very essential organisms, things like our eelgrass seeds, things like our baby scallops that we love, things like the oysters, etc. So that's in a broad sense what I do.
I know that our listeners can hear it, but I get to see it on screen with you. When you started talking about your research, your entire body sort of just opened up with this excitement and this wonder. And For me, that is the beauty of research. That is the beauty of scholarship, because you have these interests and these passions, but the research, the interest, the passion, the teaching that you're doing is having an impact to help people understand that, especially in the United States, where talking about the environment and conservation has become so politicized, you are able to say there's an economic impact of this work, and there's a quality of life impact for all of us to be able to have access to fresher, cleaner, healthier environments that can then also have an impact on the many organisms that you are interested in and studying. When you think about the impact of not necessarily those debates, but the actual changes that are happening here in Connecticut, what are you seeing in that regard that you say to our listeners, this is how it matters right here in Connecticut where we live?
That's a good question, because it has been really hard to be a scientist, especially the last couple of years. And I think part of it is when you make it these elitist scientists who are in the labs and don't understand anything about, what's going on in the real world, you kind of remove that human aspect of it. I'm doing this because I love it and I like the things I work with, and I love talking to my students and sharing my experiences with them and advising them and helping them grow as research scientists. So I think when you start, as you say, politicizing that, you are removing that. You're removing this human connection that we have and we share, because then you're not seeing me as a person who cares about the environment and wants to just share that excitement. You start painting me as a scientist who is trying to tell people what to do or lying or has a secret agenda, right? So I think having these connections and these one-on-one conversations are very important because of that, right? It allows us to keep those connections, because that's what matters at the end of the day. Not just for, when I'm teaching my students, I teach them, we as scientists did a really bad job early on with the jargon and the not being as approachable, right? So we didn't make it easy by not being able to communicate science in a way that it mattered. Even this idea of like, oh, you have to dumb it down. To me, I hate that term, because the assumption is that people are dumb, right? It's like, I'm not dumbing down anything, right? I am making it accessible. So there's a difference there. So I think we as scientists have caused some of these issues with their inability to communicate. And now with the politicization of it, it's just getting worse. So I think we have to remember a human connection, because it matters. Whether or not you are a fisherman, right? You are being affected by the environment. We work a lot in the field, or I used to work and try to do some work in the field of what we call environmental justice. If the air quality is bad, asthma rates go up. That is a public health issue. If you can't get enough food, right, because our fisheries are collapsing, you're not able to feed your family, it gets too expensive. That now becomes a humans issue. You can't feed your family, right? So you can narrow it all down to that, I think, and the humanity of it. So it's really important in Connecticut. And Connecticut has a big shellfish industry. We're also very lucky to be a blue state, and we have some wonderful Congress people that have helped the industry and have helped with the regulations, right? And have cared about the environmental things with it. So you can see that impact at the local level. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done. And I know I just rambled over like 5 million things, but that's what it comes down to, is being able to connect is very important, because it affects all of us, regardless of what you feel about your politics. Yeah.
You have mentioned the word humanity several times in our conversation. The other word or sense that I get from you is a deep sense of humility about what it means to have the honor of being a scholar. The way that you talk about your students, the care and concern. I'm also a professor. People say a lot about our profession and know very little about what it actually means for us to walk onto a campus every day knowing that it's not just our research at stake. It is the well-being and livelihood of our students who say, I've put a lot into being a college student. It's been a big investment for me. Will it pay off for me to be able to have the career that I want to go into with all of the challenges and cuts that we are seeing? How have you as a researcher and a scholar been affected by some of the funding cuts we're seeing at the federal level, the attacks on research and science? How is that showing up for you as a scholar?
So it's been mixed in terms of it adds another load that you now have to worry about. So one example I gave was we had gotten this grant and it was taken away and then given back, then taken away. And, we getting the money, but by the time that got resolved through the courts, it was too late for me to hire my summer students. So now you have a lot of students who don't have summer funding. A lot of our graduates, we say it was carnage, to be perfectly honest. They had their offers rescinded. So even if that funding was put back, it's too late for them to, start working in the summer. So we took away part of the workforce. A lot of these research grants is what gives new or early career scientists, newly graduated students, the experience to get those other jobs. So now we are removing people from the workforce. And I don't know that people realize the impact of that. It's not just, oh, you won't get to do research, is you not only don't get to do research, you don't get to gain the experience to then get a better paying job that requires you to have the experience. These government funds are one of the few places where what's a reliable way for my students to get experience. They could go for 6-8 months, work at the USGS, work at the EPA, right? And get the experience to then go into a full-time job, whether it was industry, another government job, nonprofit, etc. So we lost a lot of that. And that has been hard trying to tell students, hang in there. So a lot of it has been exhausting and just has required a lot of thinking through how do we still do the work. I am lucky being a professor that I get paid to teach. So I can still do the research. I can't hire as many students, but I can still do the research because I'm working by being, by teaching. So I am not in as bad of a position as some of my colleagues who have lost their jobs. I mentioned some work around environmental justice. All of those have been disbanded. So I feel like some of the impact that my field can have has been decreased. So that has also been disheartening, right? Because we still care about those things and we still want to push those things, but we just don't have the means to do it. So we've had to get really creative about how to do some of this work. But a lot of the people who are suffering is not just, people who have been in the federal government for years, is those new students who have graduated that now don't have a job because they're gone.
And I think people often have this perception that this is a concern or an issue for just privileged elite people who are in particular institutions. And what you've just described for us is this will have an impact on all of us. The other thing that I wonder about, Maria, is the United States always wants to be competitive. We want to be advancing understanding and knowledge in particular fields so that we can compete with other countries, so that we can be distinct from other countries. And I imagine that what's happening is other countries are watching what's happening in the US in terms of the impact of research, the impact on particular fields, and thinking about, can I recruit those scholars? Can I recruit those graduates to come and help us advance understanding in our country? Are you seeing that in your field where other places are saying, you can't get what you need in the US, so think about us? Or is that something that you're not experiencing as much?
That's a great question because we're actually seeing it. I've sent some students to do a master's degree overseas. It's like, just, if you get that opportunity to leave the country, I have some colleagues in Canada that have reached out. So we have some things going there. And I have a couple of listservs where you get things. The number of master's, PhD, and recruitment coming in from outside of the country has increased. I've seen posts in Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, where people are like, hey, you can come out and work with us for a little bit. We will hire you. So there's a couple of big centers and a couple of countries that are benefiting greatly from this. And, I don't want to name all the countries because then it becomes, we know those racist undertones of which countries are, but there are a number of countries that, we've painted as these bad places that are heavily recruiting American scientists, and American scientists are going there. So this is definitely happening. And, full disclosure, I have also encouraged my students to do that for a year or two, to go to other places, because it's a friendlier place. You can still get the experience and then have a better shot if you come back.
There's so many challenges. You said a few minutes ago, and this is a direct quote from you, it's been really hard to be a scientist. And at the same time, there is a sense of not just possibility, but responsibility that I hear when you talk about the work that you do with your students, the research that you're doing, and also the calling and pull that you feel to be a scientist in the particular ways that you are. When you think about, yes, the attacks are horrible and they are present and ever present in some ways. But there's also that infinite possibility and power of science, even and especially now. When you think about the power of science, the love that you have, what is the thing that pushes you to continue working in this field?
So I am going to say I'm going to try to practice what I preach. And one of the things I teach, because I teach a conservation biology class, and let me tell you how depressing that can get sometimes. I always start with this article looking at optimism. It was Dr. Nancy Knowlton who wrote "Doom and Gloom Won't Save the World." And it's this idea that positivity is needed because all the negativity can draw you down. So if you think about the most effective activists and the most effective work that has been done, all of them is believing you can do something. Because the minute you start thinking you can't, you've lost the battle. So for me is hanging on to that positivity. Like I have to believe we will move forward and we'll be able to do something, because otherwise what's the point, right? So there's that hopeful aspect. And then the other one is the more pragmatic stuff. I am, as I mentioned, my family immigrated here from the Dominican Republic. If I were to go back, they said you will starve there as a marine biologist. And I know here there has been communities that have gone through this way before. There has been injustice, there has been violence towards different identities for as long as the United States has been in, a country, or even before it was a country, I should say. So this idea that this is new, unfortunately, that's not true, right? So I think we have to acknowledge that we've seen this before, maybe not quite this openly, but it's not new. So if those communities can continue to thrive in the face of all this, or just continue, then we can too.
There's a sense of resistance and resilience that you have mentioned of this is not new for many people, as overwhelming as it is, and I don't want to underestimate it. You've reminded us that we can learn from how others have endured and overcome in the past, and also recommit ourselves to how even the most basic principles of science and connection can create a path forward. And so we're grateful that you are doing the work that you are doing, that you are inspiring generations of students to see beyond where they are right now and imagine who they can become, even the way that LeVar Burton and Reading Rainbow inspired you to think about marine science as a youngster. Maria Rosa is Assistant Professor of Biology at Connecticut College. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. Our interns are Coco Cooley and Isaac Moss. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.